So, getting back to our topic, this is the last day for dealing with the subject of evil. We talked about how evil is understood from the point of view of various worldviews. We talked about how evil is understood in the Far East, in particular by Buddhists and Hindus. We talked about how evil is understood by more secular philosophical perspectives, such as Marxism and Freudianism and certain other points of view. And then we looked at the Old Testament and we listed the criteria that come out of the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis on what we can say about evil. And that's in your essay. I don't have to go through those here. The Bible has a very clear perspective on evil that is presented in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis before we get to the story of salvation, as it begins with the story of the patriarchs, first Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, then the 12 tribes, then the escape from Egypt, the settlement in the promised land, the destruction of the two kingdoms, the return from exile, the rise of apocalyptic literature, where the perspective on evil changed from evil being thought of as a punishment from God to evil being thought of as something that God would deal with at the end of time. That God would, at the appropriate time, punish the evil doers in history, and those who were righteous would be welcomed into God's kingdom. Okay, so the Old Testament ends at that part. The only thing I would add is that the prophets also spoke much about this particular topic, especially Isaiah, who wrote extensively about the end of time and about how things would be when God rules. The lion will lay down with the lamb, and the child would play over the whole of the adder's den, and so forth and so on. And no one would hurt on my holy mountain ever again. Okay, so that was Isaiah. But the Old Testament leaves it at that. The Old Testament leaves it at the point where God promises that at some point God will deal with evil once and for all, but that is the end of the story. Okay? The book in the Bible that gives a hint as to how God will deal finally with evil once and for all is the book of Daniel, where in the 7th chapter Daniel talks about a son of man who will descend from the clouds of heaven, and at that point there will be a general resurrection, and God will make all things right. God will even out the scales, and evil will be done away with. There will be no more sorrow, no more tears, and all people will live in peace, in love, in justice, Jerusalem where God will rule. That's also, by the way, in the book of Revelation, which ends the New Testament. Okay, so what I do today is move on from the stories in the New Testament. We talked a little bit about how Jesus dealt with evil. Here, what I do is talk about how Jesus dealt with evil in a more general sense. Okay. So first of all, here's the way I think the Bible understands evil. Do you recall, there are several passages in the Bible where Jesus casts demons into what he calls the abyss. You recall that word, the abyss? What is the abyss?
Is it hell?
Not exactly. You could surmise that maybe something like hell is meant, but it's not. Abyss doesn't mean a place of torment and punishment. Abyss means something else.
The black hole.
The black hole. That's exactly what it means. The abyss is the place from which nothing escapes. Okay? In other words, the abyss is nothingness. Right? When we talked about how evil is both something and nothing at the same time. It's like a hole in a shirt. The hole in your shirt is nothing except the absence of fabric. But at the same time, we don't say it's nothing. We say it's a hole. Okay? So the abyss is the hole. Okay? It's nothingness. It's that from which nothing escapes. And in the world of astronomy, actually, the idea of a black hole is a good analogy for that. Why is there such a thing as what is a black hole in astronomy? What is a black hole?
Something that can't describe or explore.
Okay, you can't explore it because once you go in it, you can't escape. Yeah. But what is it that can't get out that makes it black? Light. Light. Gravity is so strong in a black hole that not even light can escape. Okay, that's what it is. So the abyss, when Jesus tosses demons into an abyss, what he is doing essentially is tossing them into a place of non-being. Okay, they no longer exist. They are essentially, they turn from something into nothing. All right, that's what the abyss is. All right. One of the first questions that philosophers asked in ancient Greece is, why is there something and not nothing? Have you ever contemplated that question? In other words, why is there anything? I mean, we can say, well, God created it. Okay, God created it. But why did God create something? And what did God create it out of?
His power.
Yes, power created it, but did God have, like a sculptor has clay in advance, and he just forms the clay into a shape? I'll never forget the time I took a class, an art class, and we had to make something for our parents, right? So I decided I was going to make a vase for my mother. Okay, and the way it came out was kind of, it was crooked, and it suffice it to say it was not an attractive vase. Okay, but she, in her love for me, said, "Oh, what a wonderful vase you made for me." So, but God doesn't start with clay. What does he start with? Yeah, a thought. Yeah. The material world is created out of nothing. We call it, the doctrine is creatio ex nihilo. That's Latin for creation out of nothing. Okay? So God creates all that exists out of nothing. All right? So there is no something before God. In fact, there's no nothing before God. God is eternal. God is the only thing that is eternally. The material world is here, but it's constantly changing, and over time this table will disintegrate and return back to its elements, just like when we go up to this is Ash Wednesday, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, were we to go up to the altar tonight, what would you hear when I put dust on your forehead? Yeah, remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Okay? All right? So, so we return to dust, but God creates from nothing. Okay, so nothing exists prior to God's creative activity. He creates out of nothing. So, there is no abyss, okay, with respect to God. But what there is the possibility of an abyss. In other words, when God creates all things out of nothing, and those things become vulnerable to returning back to what they came from, there is the possibility that what God created from nothing could go back to nothing. Okay? So the abyss is that state of existence where there is no existence. That's kind of a contradiction, but there's no existence in an abyss. Okay, so now think about evil for a moment. But let's do so by first thinking about the ministry of Jesus. All right? Everything Jesus does is an attempt to confront the abyss. Everything he does is a way in which he confronts that which is turning back into nothing. Okay? So when he heals a man who is sick, what he is doing is restoring life where there would have been death. When he restores a man who is blind, he is giving sight to where there otherwise would not have been sight. When he is casting out a demon and throwing it into an abyss or throwing it into a pig who then commits suicide, it is returning back into nothingness. All right? So evil in Jesus' ministry is returned to the abyss from whence it came. Whereas God's good creation in Jesus' ministry is restored. Okay? So let's take some of the examples we talked about before where Jesus reverses, he reverses what happens. The ancient Jews understood that certain things would become unclean before God because they were vulnerable to returning to the abyss. Okay, they were no longer good, they were bad. Okay, so before God, they were unclean, or they were bad, or whatever word you want to use. Okay? Leprosy was one. A dead body was another one. A person who is bleeding could bleed out, which means they would die. So that was another one. Okay, so what Jesus does in relation to these things that would otherwise possibly return someone to non-existence, okay? What he does is he reverses that. He takes in the power of non-existence into himself. He takes the leprosy into himself and transfers his health to the leper, or the little girl who died. He absorbs the power of death and restores her to life. So you see, Jesus has power over the abyss, over, you could say, over evil. Jesus, in his ministry, demonstrates that he has the power to overcome evil in all of its forms. All right? He does the same thing when he feeds people who are hungry. He does the same thing when he saves his disciples from the storm. And he does the same thing when he saves Peter's mother-in-law from dying of what could have been malaria, because there were, around the Sea of Galilee at this time, it was very swampy, and it was covered with insects, and it was tropical, and they carried a lot of diseases, okay, and people were getting fevers all over the place. There were no antibiotics, there were no antivirals, there was no way to treat them. And so unless they had a natural immune system that was able to fight it off, they died. They returned to the ground from whence they came. Remember, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Okay? So Jesus is able to reverse all this. All right, so for this reason, he excoriates the Pharisees and the scribes, because, you see, they're afraid. They're afraid of this power of evil which has entered into the world. Okay, now what the Bible does not do is tell us how evil got here. It doesn't do that. It simply posits the fact that in the Garden of Eden, there was a snake who was evil. Okay, it doesn't say where the snake came from, but it was there. Okay, So there's no speculation about where evil came from. There's just the bare fact that it exists. And God is determined to fight against it and eventually overcome it and destroy it. Okay, that is God's goal. That's what it means to be saved. To be saved is to be immune from the power of evil. Okay? So once you are in a state of salvation, and Paul struggles with what this means when it comes to the resurrection body in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, he talks about how the mortal must take on the immortal, and the changeable takes on the inchangeable, and so forth and so on. Okay? Paul struggles with trying to explain that. Okay, so, but the Pharisees are afraid of it, which is why they complain to Jesus when his disciples won't do the things they're supposed to do to insulate themselves from evil. All right, so even when it's as simple a thing as washing pots or washing your hands before you eat, okay, there's dirt on there. And for the Pharisees, see, the Pharisees speculate, what if you inadvertently touched something that had the power of evil inherent in its existence? All right, I won't go into what that might be, but you might think, you might figure it out for yourself, okay? So, what if you inadvertently did that? Well, there's only one way to protect yourself against it. Wash your hands first before you eat. Otherwise, you might ingest it. And if you ingest it, you would become unclean before God. All right? Jesus reverses that. What he says is, no. It's not what goes into the body that defiles, it's what comes out. Okay? And then he refers to the human heart. The human heart has thoughts that can result in evil behavior, which in turn can result in people being adversely affected by evil. All right? So he mentions murder, he mentions theft, he mentions, most of the commandments pertaining to our relationship with other people. The second 7 commandments of the 10 commandments. Which begins with honor your father and your mother and ends with don't covet your neighbor's spouse. So he mentions those 7 commandments, all of which are intended. Okay, so if the Pharisees, instead of worrying about what people touched and contaminated their hands with substances that contained the possible power of evil, if instead of that they worried about what came out of their hearts and what they might do as a result of that, then they would be truly protecting themselves from doing that which could result in evil affecting other people. All right? which is what the commandments are designed to keep us from doing. All right? So, if we're in I know I've used this example many times, but it's a perfect example of what is intended by the commandment against lying. If you are in a court of law and you lie about what the defendant actually did, what in effect you end up doing is causing a person who is innocent to be punished for something that they didn't do. And that is evil. Okay? So for Jesus, it's what comes out of your heart, not what you ingest into your body. That is evil. All right? Okay, so of course, the thing he does the most, if you were to count all of Jesus' miracles, which miracle do you think he does the most? Yes, but a certain kind. What does he do more often than anything else?
Forgive.
He casts out demons. Yes. He casts out demons. Okay, so he frees people from forces of evil that could cause them to do things that would be self-destructive and destructive of others. Okay. All right. Now, speaking of the class we're going to get to next time, relating forgiveness to this, forgiveness is intended to do the same thing. Forgiveness is intended to release the sinner from being bound to the evil that the sinner has done in the past. If you can never be released from that, you can also never start anew and be transformed into a new person. The purpose of forgiveness is transformation, to change a person into a new person. That's why repentance is required for forgiveness. Remember the parable. Jesus says, there was a king who had a bunch of slaves. One slave owed the king 10,000 talents, which is in the millions of dollars. And the king said, turn this guy over to the torturers and throw him in prison. Oh, please, master, I'll pay you back everything I owe you. The king had pity on this guy. Okay? The king showed kindness and compassion, and he forgave him the debt, which enabled him to start a new life. But unfortunately, the lesson was lost on this guy, because then when he found somebody who owed him a pittance, he grabbed him by the throat and said, pay me what you owe me. And the king found out about it, okay? And when the king found out about it, he revoked the forgiveness and threw the guy into debtor's prison. All right. Which suggests the same thing that we pray in the Lord's Prayer. If we are not willing to forgive, then God is not willing to forgive us. The purpose of divine forgiveness is to change us into compassionate people. People who also, in turn, will the same way in which we ourselves have been forgiven. All right? So when you're released of something that could result in your ultimate destruction, if you don't have any gratitude for that, my goodness, there's something wrong with you, right? And obviously, Christians believe that forgiveness is the result of God having given his life so that we could be forgiven. It wasn't cheap. It cost him his life. And for us to ignore the fact that it cost God the life of his only Son so that we can be forgiven is the height of ingratitude. It doesn't get much worse than that. All right. Now let's tie it all together. Okay, so Jesus, all these subplots, Jesus is fighting against the power of the abyss, which is touching people in all of these various forms: sickness, natural disasters, leprosy, hunger, injustice, all of these things. He is changing lives and lifting up the lowly and enabling them to live a new life, just as the parable of the prodigal son. I was so happy the other day when I planned the services for February to find out that it was either the third or fourth Sunday of February. Guess what the gospel text is? The parable of the prodigal son. I love that parable. I could preach on that parable. You better bring an extra coat that day, because that made me going on and on. Anyway, that's what that parable is about. The prodigal son becomes a new person. Okay, so if you pull it all together and then add to it the story of Jesus' passion, where, remember last week we talked about how all the forces of evil came together in all these different ways. The disciples desert him. The authorities lie about him. Pilate is too wimpy to do anything about it. He just lets them do what they want. All these sins of omission and commission come together and conspire such that he ends up on the cross. All right? So the question then becomes, and it's been the question the Jews have asked from the beginning, with the exception, of course, of the original Christians, which were all Jews. How can a convicted, crucified criminal be the king of the Jews, be the Messiah? How can that possibly be?
Well, he wasn't guilty of what he was into.
He was not. He was not. Nevertheless, he was put to death. He died. They took him down from the cross. They laid him in the tomb. He was dead.
He rose again.
He rose again, which means, what in essence does that mean? What did he do? He defeated death. He defeated the last enemy. Okay, the power behind evil is death. Okay? How do tyrants, in any form, whether it's a mobster who wants to extort money from a local store owner, or a common criminal who's holding a gun at somebody and demanding their money, or a guy like Vladimir Putin, how do tyrants get what they want? They threaten death. That's what they do. They threaten death. Okay? And so death is the final enemy, because death is non-being. It's non-existence. You die, that's the end of your life. Okay? Now, we as Christians do not believe that death is the end of life. And why don't we believe that? That's right, because Jesus rose from Jesus defeated death. So all who belong to him will be raised together with him. Okay? So the way Jesus defeats ultimately the power of evil in the world is not through violence. And had Jesus decided to lead a rebellion against the Romans, and there had been a bloodbath, even if he had won, ultimately, what would have won? Evil would have won. Yeah, violence would have won. Violence would have been the winner of any violent rebellion. Okay? So when, that's, so what the Christian faith represents is the ultimate answer to the power of evil, the force behind which is the threat of death. Okay? Because the Christian gospel neutralizes that threat and promises you life in God's kingdom. Now, it requires a lot of faith to believe that, especially when you're on your deathbed. It requires a lot of faith. But how many times did Jesus ask his disciples, "Where is your faith?" Over and over again. Yeah. Where is your faith? So the ultimate answer to evil on the part of the Christian faith is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That is the answer. Okay? Does that all make sense? Questions, comments, anything that I said that sounds ridiculous? Jesus saw it. Jesus was willing. Jesus was willing to die so that he could defeat death. It's sometimes hard for us to fully understand what our own message is. Okay?